In this episode of Future Intersections presented by Wells Fargo, we're going to discuss the importance of accountability in driving results. There are essentially three dimensions: organizational accountability, team accountability, and individual accountability. Organizational accountability is about clearly defining and continually articulating the company's mission, values, and goals or strategic priorities, as well as everyone's role in working towards them. It's about designing and nurturing a culture of accountability where clear performance and behavior standards are defined and measured. It's about holding employees and executives responsible for accomplishing these goals, completing assignments, and making decisions that deliver on these expectations. Employee dynamics are continuing to evolve in our hyper-connected world. Companies need to reflect and determine how to best reshape their approach in keeping their workforce happy, productive, and engaged. Reducing burnout is a strategic imperative. Join me, Ather Williams III, and my special guest, Brent Gleeson, award-winning entrepreneur and former Navy SEAL, as we unpack the trends and discuss opportunities to improve engagement and accountability. So welcome to Future Intersections. My name is Ather Williams, and I want to welcome Brent Gleeson. And so, Brent, I'd love for you to talk about a little bit about your background as a SEAL and how it got you to where you are today.
First of all, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, and always good to see you. I grew up in Dallas, so went in 7 months before 9/11. Did several combat deployments, and then transitioned out. Went to graduate school, and then dove headfirst into the world of business and entrepreneurship, which arguably has the same failure rate as SEAL trainings. And what my current organization does is taking a lot of these principles, methodologies, and frameworks that we've designed and built and evolved over the decades, and taking many of those principles and learning how we can apply those here in the very dynamic world of modern business, where change was already the constant. Now we're layering in a global pandemic, civil, social, and political unrest, economic and financial uncertainty. So the pressure on organizations, and specifically the leaders and managers within these organizations, to keep their arms wrapped around all this is a significant challenge.
I think that some of the things you just mentioned between political, social unrest, the pandemic, has changed a lot of those dynamics and what people are looking for from their companies and what companies are looking for from their employees. Maybe we should start with sort of that impact, the impact the pandemic has had. People have come through this sort of with a different perspective, it seems, on what they want out of work. Right. We already had a generational shift coming in where people were saying that, my values need to be reflected in my employers, right, or candidly in companies I associate with. So brands I purchase from, what kind of car I drive, what kind of clothes I wear, all associated with my personal values, which is something that's been relatively new in my arc of my career. So I'd love to get your perspective on. Let's kind of unpack the accountability, pyramid, if you will.
Like I referenced before, we were already, pre-pandemic, already dealing with the constant state of organizational change, external, internal factors, digital transformation, technological advancements, and of course, now having on average 5 generations in the workforce in a large organization, especially, as opposed to what historically was 3 generations in the workforce. And to your point earlier, the different needs, the connectivity or the desire to have connectivity to the organization's value system, different motivating factors, both intrinsic and extrinsic, with these different generations, again, putting new pressures on managers that need to level up in their skill sets and understanding how to engage, how to mentor and coach these different people within their teams and within the organization. And so then layering in all these additional complexities with being forced to have a remote workforce. Now we're moving into the hybrid workforce, and now we're going to get into that and talking about disengagement and what those percentages are now, looking at burnout, employee burnout. I've got some interesting statistics on that. And then, of course, the quiet quitting and the great resignation. But again, from a leadership perspective, that's why they call it the burden of command. A lot of these things are putting the onus on leaders and managers in the organizations at every level to better equip themselves to get back to the root of what a great organization is.
So you use the term burden of command, which I really like, because I think that as I think about what leadership has meant over the last decades of my career, has changed. Okay. So it used to be you were the subject matter expert, you had the most knowledge, and therefore you controlled that and you sort of drilled that down to your teams. It's morphed into being the person who is the best coach, who can get the people with the right skills in the right positions to perform the job well, So that's changed. That's required a different mindset from leaders and from managers, and then connecting them, to your point, back to the mission of the organization. So what lessons do you think that people should need to learn, both from a manager standpoint or kind of from an employee standpoint, to actually make this work in this new environment?
A lot of these tools, the tactics and strategies, are not that dissimilar from what we should have been at least using as organizational leaders in our organizations in the past.
Yeah.
Now we have to take a little bit of a different perspective and reprioritize these things outside of just revenue growth, profitability growth, EBITDA, all the things that we measure as an organization. But when it comes to, kind of back to your point around accountability, it's a byproduct of other things, of a very clearly articulated mission, a very well-defined set of core values, a well-defined purpose for the organization, something that can be articulated and evangelized across the organization, not just at the top, and it doesn't dissolve as you go layers down towards the front line. But then it comes down to alignment on strategic priorities, role clarity, team level clarity on what the priorities are, training and development, engagement strategies, all these different things that have always been there. They're just under a new lens now and need to be prioritized much more. All those things lead to greater level of accountability. And ultimately, when you have high degrees of accountability, it's not a negative thing. It leads to higher morale, higher retention, higher performance from the individual and team level, and therefore a greater customer experience or client experience, what have you, and greater levels of growth and profitability. But now we have to reprioritize these things at the expense of other things as leaders.
And so you referenced frameworks.
Yep.
So can you peel back that onion a little bit more and get into some of the frameworks that you've maybe learned in your days as a SEAL or in your days as an entrepreneur or
Sure.
as an author, and applied it to organizations, and how you build. It's almost like mutual accountability, right? It's that the senior leadership owes something to the employees in the company, and the company and the employees owe something back, so that we kind of hold each other accountable in a sense. But what frameworks do you think that are helpful that we can apply? Or
I think one that's more relevant now than ever is first, the philosophy of servant leadership. So taking your organizational chart, turning it upside down, and realizing that we really need to be stewards and servants to those that we lead, providing them with the right resources, the right coaching, right mentorship, training, but also new elements around focuses on physical health, mental well-being. These things are critically important to combating burnout, but also just being like I said, better coaches and paying attention more, asking the right questions. So, the behaviors, the beliefs, guiding principles, core values, the rituals that we need to design in our organizations to support the appropriate beliefs. Those things, as you go up those layers in that pyramid, lead to taking the appropriate and aligned actions based on the strategic imperatives so that you achieve specific results. But in any type of organizational transformation, whether it's full-scale macro transformation or just micro, rolling out a new software program, especially at the leadership level and management level, there have to be new beliefs. But also, more importantly, as leaders, what are we doing to evangelize the new way? And what are we doing to keep our people connected and engaged? Because oftentimes in this level of change, people will start to disengage if leaders and managers don't do a great job explaining the purpose and why behind all those different initiatives that the organization is going through.
So, Brent, one of the concepts we started talking about at the beginning of this conversation was around accountability. And there's a couple of things, macro trends that sort of are swirling around, whether they're media, but they're actually kind of real. So we talked about the quiet, there's quiet quitting. There was a great resignation, which, given the economic conditions, have sort of changed a little bit. A lot of people left their jobs and then said, "Oh, man, it wasn't a good idea.
The grass wasn't greener."
Exactly. And then but you also have people who are sort of, I'll call it, where they're not engaged, or they've quietly quit and they're sort of like rebalancing their own priorities around work without really communicating that to their company, or their company really understanding that's what they need, which has led to lots of wars around return to office and working from home and flexibility, all things which are interesting. And candidly, also, you mentioned something earlier, which is around mental health, which I think is something that I know from most of my career was not something people would talk about. It was one of those things where it was almost like if you were in the NFL, like, don't talk about concussions or don't talk about like I'm hurt.
In the military.
Yeah, just keep going. Now it's a much more open dialogue, which I think is healthier for all of us to have that discussion about how are we feeling, because you have to be physically and mentally fit to perform.
Yeah.
But the challenge, I think, for organizations is how do I maintain productivity, deliver on our mission and our goals, and engage employees the right way?
Just prior to the pandemic, engagement was actually going up because we were starting to focus more on, this is important. We've got all these different generations in the workforce and different needs from our team members and lofty goals to achieve. And so engagement still hovers now around 25 to 30%. That hasn't necessarily changed. But we're looking at now is the levels of burnout. Interestingly, one of the things that we see that always falls when we do surveys or 360 reviews with organizations and leaders, one of the things that always falls into we'll call it the opportunity category, an area of focus or refocus, is identifying burnout. And that's, I think, in large part related to the current state that we're in. The other opportunity, obviously, is collecting more anonymous feedback, from, through employee engagement surveys, pulse surveys, things like that. But then doing something with the feedback. Historically, a lot of organizations will check that box, put that on that data on the digital shelf and let it collect dust.
So in your research, is that the rate of burnout, is it consistent between those groups? So you mentioned you have your high performers, you're truly engaged, your stars. Then you've got sort of the middle that are there, but they're not actively disengaged. They're not as fully engaged as your top performers. And then you have the actively disengaged. And the reason I ask that is because I think about it in my experience, whether it's in sports or what I've learned about your experience in the military or in business, is that when you get that top tier, that top 10, 15% of actively engaged, you tend to spend more time on them because they're delivering the results. And so you invest in them, you give them more opportunities, and you burn them out faster. Because whether it's constantly deploying your special operations troops, or it's constantly throwing those hard, difficult assignments in your top employees, or it's giving the ball to your same running back every play because they're getting 6-7 yards, right, eventually you're going to burn them out. How do you, so is that engagement consistent? And then how do you work with managers to think about, all right, your stars are good, you need to spend time on them, to your point, don't cancel your one-on-ones, but you also need to figure out how you get more or understand what this middle group needs. Sure. And then I personally believe that the bottom group is sometimes can be a drag on the organization.
100% correct on your star players. And oftentimes, as high-performing individuals, the strengths are the weaknesses as well. Saying yes to everything, taking on too much, but also sometimes not raising their hand and saying, we need to delegate this to someone else, or this is a competing priority. Where do I shift these other priorities? They just say, yep, put it on my plate. And then before you know it, they put in their 2 weeks notice. Heavy workload is what we've seen now, sort of 2 years into this pandemic, where we've had people leaving the workforce, the talent pool dwindling. So obviously that work has to go to somebody. And that is what has been driving some of this quiet quitting concept, where when we first talked about it, I was like, well, isn't that just disengagement? And upon further research, it has a very specific definition of, I am intentionally choosing to only do the work under the confines of my very specific job description. I will not go above and beyond. I will not work after hours. I will not tackle other projects that aren't really, within my team or my division or within my roles and responsibilities. So to me, that feels like active disengagement, not just disengagement, because I am intentionally choosing to not do more work, and from my background in the SEAL teams, to not support the team or the organization's mission, but this is driven by other things. These are driven by people with, I think, good intentions, when it comes to, like you said at the very beginning, the reevaluation, like we've all gone through over the past few years, of what's really important to us personally, what's important to us financially, professionally, from a health and wellness perspective, reevaluating our careers or our value systems and things like that.
We've had this parallel dialogue around diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So adding more diversity to the workforce has been good. Creating an equitable environment is great. That inclusion piece has always been elusive. That how do you get this, melting pot of people together and then have everyone feel like they can be themselves and contribute, which to me is very tied to this engagement.
Yeah.
So if I'm not included, am I really engaged? And how do I, train our managers, our leaders, to understand that? And then more importantly, how do I get our employees to tell us when they're not feeling that way versus just sort of checking out and not being there, being present but not being present?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. This is something I studied a lot, for my first book before the pandemic. A lot around culture and engagement strategies and whatnot. And prior to the pandemic, all the data kind of came around the same. It was like 15 to 20% engagement. So employees who are what I would say all in all the time, they go above and beyond. They're your A players. They believe in the mission and they help others. They take on roles and responsibilities outside their job description. Then you have what typically would be the bulk of the workforce, which is disengaged. Not always a bad thing, just people kind of doing their jobs, not necessarily always doing the bare minimum, but kind of the bare minimum within the confines of their job function. But also that is the manager's biggest opportunity because especially mid-level managers, they really have the opportunity to touch and impact the majority of the workforce. So that's the opportunity. The actively disengaged is your other subset, usually around 15 to 18%. Those are your agitators. They're working against the organization, especially during times of change. Yeah. The challenge there is oftentimes your actively disengaged have a voice because of tenure or subject matter expertise or both, so that cancer can grow a little more quickly. But oftentimes as leaders, we pay attention more to the disengaged and actively disengaged and forget about our star performers who need oftentimes just as much coaching and mentorship and attention from their leaders and direct managers.
So I feel like the linkage between results, accountability, and being a good coach and mentor is feedback. Yeah. And at least from what I've learned from you about your experience in the teams and your experience in business, like, in the teams that's foundational. It seems that it's a, whatever size group you're in, if it's a platoon, both the officer and the enlisted, you're all together sort of like debriefing on whether it's training or a real world mission. It's all about like holding each other accountable, but part of that is discussing what went well and what didn't go well and what we need from each other. And I feel like in companies, that performance management process gets a little bit administrative unless it's either for evaluating, ranking, or gets too tied to compensation, and it's not actually about development.
Right.
Like, what do you actually need from me? What do I need from you?
Right.
What can you do better? How can I help you? It's not that conversation, and it's hard to hold someone accountable when you haven't helped them be successful.
But such a common mistake that we all make. I've made it a million times. I'm holding you accountable, or I'm delegating, or giving you autonomy and authority, but I set you up to fail because I didn't provide you with the resources or training.
What can I do better as a leader to make sure they're tied to the mission, they understand that we're all aligned around that mission, and then I can hold them accountable, but I also can help coach and mentor them to get there.
One of the things, and this is obviously a biased opinion from my military background, but we do this ourselves in my organization. We teach it to leaders and organizations all over the world, and is the basic function of debriefing, or what we call an after-action review in the military. This can be formal and can be informal, but to create a culture of greater level of transparency, communication up and down the chain of command and horizontally, you do have to have formal mechanisms and consistent rituals in place to start that behavioral shift where you create greater levels of psychological safety. You can engage in radical candor and have critical conversations, again, both up and down the chain of command, where people will feel open to voicing their opinion. Not too much. My first deployment, we did tons and tons of operations in the 6-month period, sometimes 2 or 3 in a night. But we never ever skipped the process because it's so critically important to learning and development. And so we would, whether we're debriefing in a helicopter or back of a pickup truck or formally in a room like this with a PowerPoint presentation and layers of higher ups in the echelon of leadership, first and foremost, you leave rank and emotion at the door, in theory. You might get punched in the face after the meeting, but in the meeting, in the after-action review, rank and emotion is left at the door to create that expectation of psychological safety that if I'm the newest person on the team, I can and am expected to voice my opinion, ask critical questions, even if I think the question is dumb or irrelevant. You need to learn to ask. And one of the best ways to set that tone, if I'm the senior person or the leader of that debrief, I will start by saying, this is a great win, guys. Obviously set the tone for why we're here. Here's what we're going to learn. We want these actionable insights. Here's what I could have done better, I think, as the leader, and as a servant to you guys, there's a few things that I noted that I'm going to level up on. I'm going to take some action on those things. By doing that, obviously, you're continually and repetitively setting the tone for transparency and openness. And then you get into what we did well, what we didn't. And then a lot of organizations that say, or teams that say they debrief, they kind of stop right there, the meeting ends, and that's it. I mean, half the time you're at the team, you might be sitting there after your workout or what have you, if you don't have a training scenario, reading intel reports and reading those debriefs and what comes out of them. And we're using this information to change the way we train. We're using this information to adjust our talent acquisition strategy. This is the way we're going to, adjust this tactic on our close quarters battle skills. All these very specific, measurable things. But again, that ritual, regardless of what comes out of it, is a great tool to promote continuous development, but like peer-to-peer learning, not formal training programs. But if you have a high-performing team, we should always be learning from each other. And not just you learning from the team as the senior person, but, the team learning from you, but, you learning from them. If you've assembled a great high-functioning team, I learn more from my team, I think, than they learn from me. That's a fact, actually.
It's a very odd paradigm that I think we all need to think about how we change and create that transparency that others can learn from it. I think that's really quite special, I think, and something we can adopt. The other thing is when you talked about the most senior person in the room setting the tone, I think of that in the context of psychological safety, which is something that often organizations don't create enough of, which is that, the most junior person or the person who doesn't feel included can feel safe enough that you can get the value out of them. One of the things I always preach to my teams is that if you're in the room, you have to have a voice. If you want to be in the room where it happens, to quote that line from Hamilton, then you need to add value when you're in the room. Right. But then it's incumbent upon me as a leader to make sure they feel comfortable to do that. And it's not, you're here to be seen and not heard. Or junior guys, be quiet, or junior girl, be quiet until you're senior enough to have something to say. Well, how are they ever going to get there?
Yeah.
So
or why are they there in the first place?
Exactly. Yeah. So if it's one of those conversations, then don't invite them in the room. But if you're going to have them in the room, create the environment where they're going to contribute. Because I do think you're right. In this world going forward of servant leadership, the team needs to carry the water, and we just need to make sure we guide them along the way versus, I'm going to just follow me this way. So part of it is, I think that, from my entire life since I got out of high school, everyone's talking about, there's one way and it's up. And there's a difference between a job and a career. And I've always been focused on building a career, which is that in my words means a continuously evolving set of skills and responsibilities that enable you to grow and develop and do more and have more impact. But that path may not be for everybody. And there's also people who just say, look, my priorities are different. Yeah. I want to be able to support my family and sort of do this. And I think we as companies have to start thinking through how do we then both bring the right talent in and how do we create the right structures around learning and development. Learning and development is a very different concept. And that's about how do you actually take people and say, what are you interested in? Where are your passions and industry? How can we help you figure out your path to delivering our company's mission? That's a lot harder thing to do. And it's much more, and it's also not the responsibility of HR. Right? Because a lot of people are, that's HR's job. They'll figure it out. Well, no, use the manager to your point. I need to understand what you're doing, what you're interested in, what makes you tick, what the organization needs, and then HR can help me structure something.
You have to have the resources to capitalize on those promises.
Absolutely. But it's not outsourced. Yeah. Which I think is a completely different mindset for managers and candidly for employees. But I'd love to get, what do you think?
And it's a different skill set, and it's a different layering of the manager's priorities, is making the time to be able to do these things. And as senior leaders in organizations, giving those managers, especially mid-level managers, which is a large portion of the organization, the resources and skills to be coaches, mentors, know how to ask the right questions and when, and then actually, like I said, be able to fulfill to a degree whatever promises are made. If I'm going to be asking you what you're interested in, is there another area of the organization you want to go to? What kind of training do you need? And not, again, technical skills of job function, but personal and professional development, which are wildly different things. It's a different priority that takes time, it takes resources, it takes budget, and training of the people who are going to be offering this to their people, but it's also, and has been, one of the greatest ways to attract and retain top talent. And all the data is still the same, and it's something that we have to get back to as leaders and managers in our organizations, of reinvesting in training and development, not just the technical skills, but real professional development and personal development, and providing sometimes resources to team members so they can take that development on themselves and have accountability over that. But they have to have the time and resources, and typically that doesn't mean after hours. That means during work hours. If we're really authentically offering it to them, it has to be done, or time has to be made during your normal work hours typically. And that's whether you're remote, whether you're in office, whether you're hybrid. It ranks at the top. Training and development ranks at the top of one of the most important engagement and retention strategies. Has and still persists. Now it's more important than ever.
So you mentioned, in talking about sort of the evolution of special forces and particularly the teams, sort of this pushing out authority and accountability and decision making to the people closest to the problem. And so, in our company, we're going through this digital transformation, which there's lots of pieces to that. Everyone thinks about going from on-prem to cloud and going from mainframe to mobile and all that stuff. That's all true. But the real challenge of making an organization go to really undertake a digital transformation is driving agility, which is a completely different way of working. Right? So I came up much of my career in a very command and control sort of environment where it was like most senior person with most knowledge kind of handed out tasks and everyone did them.
It's the good old days.
Yeah, exactly. Things are simple. But now we're in a place where we're trying to stand up independent teams that are together.
Yep.
Almost like you would have, in a SEAL team where here's a platoon and they're together. There's a leader and they're work together to complete a task, and they stay together and they're constantly on that mission. Getting managers to now understand, all right, we're going to empower this team and let them go and do their thing is a challenge, because now they're trying to figure out what their role is. So what's my role? When I'm not managing the backlog or handing out the tasks, what do I do?
Right.
And this is where I started having this conversation. Well, your job is to coach.
Yes.
Right? Connect them to the broader mission, connect them to the customer, and help them measure the outcomes and making sure they're actually being productive. That's a very different role for a manager or leader than all right, here's what we're going to do this month and this quarter, and that's a very different thing. And so the real challenge now is, to point out learning development, is how do I take those managers that spent their career managing one way and help them learn and develop into a coach. It's almost like if you go, I think about this the other way. So I grew up playing competitive sports, and you look at the number of star athletes who fail as coaches.
Right.
Big fan of Magic Johnson, favorite player of all time, Hall of Famer, one of the greatest to ever play the game, point guard, floor general, horrible coach.
Yeah. Like taking your top salesperson and making them VP of sales when they don't want to be VP of sales.
Exactly. And so how do you think, thinking about that transition of like the skills, to your point, you made this point earlier, the skills that got you here are not going to get you there. The managers that ran companies before aren't going to run the future. The people are different. I look at my kids who are, or in their college years, they want something different out of their leaders, their interactions, the companies, than I even thought was possible when I was getting a job, 30 years ago coming out of college. So it's a lot there, but let's dig into that a little bit about how we think about that front line.
Yeah, but I think it's such an amazing opportunity, though, for managers to be able to prioritize reconnecting with their people. It's a very fulfilling thing to be able to do, to be a coach, to be a mentor, to see your people grow, thrive, develop personally and professionally, and to see the result of that. When you stop being the command and control top-down manager, when it's very task-oriented, things like that, that's not a high-performing team at all. And it doesn't exist in special operations. It doesn't exist in the top winning sports teams, nor in a high-functioning business organization. But again, to your point, it's a different skill. Some people naturally have that inclination, but if they did, they probably were already doing that to a degree. Some people do not have that inclination nor skill set yet. They must take that on. Or oftentimes maybe possibly not be a leader of people. We obviously, believe in the philosophy of leadership at all levels. So managers need to be able to have leadership skills. in my organization, we break down these attributes of high-performing teams first into two dimensions. One is relationships, because all teams are made up of people, which is why all teams are inherently flawed. And then results, because all high-performing teams are extremely results-focused and they measure everything. But we take it another layer deep into what we call the 3 A's. One is, and you said alignment. Obviously, strategic alignment is critically important. Accountability, in our opinion, the number one most important pillar culturally of a high-performing team, and agility, to your point earlier. Agility being probably, as long as you have alignment and accountability, now the manager's most important tool, their most important weapon in their kit box, if you will. And some have it and some don't. But being able to shift those priorities with, they have to have the resources and backing of leadership to develop those skills if they need to. And some of those need to be very specific skills. Like I said before, how to conduct a really properly structured, well-prepared for a one-on-one, how to be a coach and mentor, a true coach and mentor, and making the time to do so. Because oftentimes that's going to mean a reprioritization of the manager's to-do list, which needs approval from their boss. And so if the manager still has all of this huge swath of competing priorities, they won't be able to, and they're measured on those priorities, they will not be able to even make the time to be in coach and mentor. That's a huge blockage that we still see because they just don't frankly have the time. And if they're not being supported by those above them to be that coach and mentor and shift those priorities, then they're measured on those, they're not going to do it.
It's kind of mind-boggling to me is that there's 5 generations in the workforce, right? And they're very different in terms of expectations, just because of longevity, one. But 2, just candidly, the youngest are a born digital environment where they've never lived in a world without a cell phone in their hand. Most of them a smartphone. Because of that, they're in a world where facts and information have always been at their fingertips. And so that changes a lot is how we as companies and organizations are thinking about integrating these people into our organizations because they have different expectations. They also have different attention spans. And so I think we also have to think about then part of that development cycle is how do we create that dynamic in the environment where things are appropriate for the audience. Yeah. And it's not just, well, I learned this way, so you have to learn that way.
I think in simplest form, it comes down to, and again, always a principle of good leadership is becoming more empathetic leaders. And not in an inauthentic or cliche way, but understanding from a motivation theory standpoint, you also need to create a team dynamic where I, as a manager, have the skills and tools to motivate everybody in a very similar fashion, which is a much more scalable model. As long as I, understand that layer below of what each team member needs and is motivated by. Interestingly, when we look at the degrees of disengagement with virtual or hybrid workforce, the highest levels of sort of a dip in morale, a dip in engagement is amongst the millennials and Gen Z. And I think that kind of goes back to the factors of the types of things they need, attention span, social interactivity, connectivity to the company's values and things like that, because in a lot of organizations, we haven't shifted quickly enough. And I think most organizations have gotten better at this because we haven't seen engagement dip so much, but we've seen active disengagement come up.
So let's throw one last wrinkle into this.
Yeah.
Hybrid working. Part of it's my personality. So I get my energy from sitting here with you. I would never want to do this with you over a video. I want to be in the room with you because the energy is different. And even as good as video technology is, there's nothing for me better than that personal interaction, being in the room and see all the little ticks and talks and everything that goes around, and that makes the conversation real. You now have managers who now have to manage, some people are in the office, some people are out of the office, and which, though, don't get me wrong, there are some great benefits to having time out of the office. I personally use that time for my deep thinking. I need to decompress and read, absorb knowledge, write things. That's my time to do that, where I'm not constantly interrupted, and you can get into that deep thinking mode as a manager to figure out how you balance that. It doesn't mean it can't work. There's some companies that do it really well. I think we're in the process of trying to figure out what's the right thing for people's mental health, their engagement, and productivity. How do we balance those things?
It's tough. I'm kind of old school in the same way. Even though our organization has more traditionally been sort of hybrid. We have team members who are scattered all over by the nature of how we're structured as a consulting firm. We don't have to have a hub of people all in one place. We typically go to our client partners' offices as opposed to them coming to us. And guilty as charged. After during COVID, we didn't renew our office lease, but we reinvested. Sorry for the commercial real estate world, but we reinvested that money in technology.
Okay.
And for our team, it's worked really, really well. But at the same time, we do have obviously workforces that have been challenged by it, and a lot of the research goes back to the burnout element. I know my team, because of the nature of who they are, they're working more now than ever. So as leaders, we have to be good stewards to them and lead by example in that regard by saying, guys, you need to take more breaks. Creating a culture around wellness. I think physical, I've always been a big proponent for physical and emotional and mental wellness, because kind of like we said before, healthy, happy people are more productive, they make better decisions, and they provide better results for the organization. So why wouldn't you want to promote that regardless of the current state of the world we live in? Now it's more important than ever before because we've seen an uptick in mental health, and all this research shows that people, what's driving the Great Resignation is they're feeling underappreciated and underserved in the organization, while also getting more work dumped on them. Yeah. So we have to be very, very cognizant of the work we're putting on our team, the expectations or perceived expectations they have from us. But it's going down to some of those simple things of engaging as a manager your hybrid or remote workforce is really focusing some time and energy on identifying burnout, making sure you're leading by example and taking breaks. We can say, well, guys, you guys, like in my company, we have unlimited vacation. We started before COVID. And not that you have to do things like that. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of perks, because it's so much more than perks. It's about leadership. You can have all the perks that you want, but if you don't have a good leader that you can work with. I mean, people, not to sound cliche, people leave their manager. So if I say, well, you guys need to take more breaks and do this, but I'm sending emails to them on Sunday afternoon, even if I say you don't need to respond to this now, I'm kind of setting the tone that that's not really authentic in that gesture. So it's really paying attention to their mental and emotional well-being by asking them how they're doing, what resources they need, making sure they're taking appropriate breaks, and whether old school or not, the hybrid and virtual work environment is just a current reality. So it's a mindset shift for us as leaders to accept that and find ways to navigate around it while still generating the results we need to as organizations.
I think that's I think modeling the right behaviors was one of the things I pulled out of that. But let's pivot a little bit and talk about we've talked a lot about the sort of things that are challenges and struggles and stuff that we all have to sort of work through in this new world. But the interesting part is, despite the most recent, bouts of inflation, in which we can debate the drivers all day long, productivity didn't really dip through a 3-year period where people were really locked down and flipped. I mean, you can look at different studies, but generally productivity stayed where it is. We've got economic growth. We've got still have a globalization despite some, geopolitical issues going on in various parts of the world, but we've always had those. Yeah. When you think about how companies have evolved and how leadership has evolved, what's going right?
There's an interesting study we were looking at by MIT Sloan, where looking at, and if you've been to business school, you know that everything can live in a 2x2 quadrant. Everything. And that quadrant was engagement and resilience. While the two can play in similar sectors, they're not exactly always the same thing. You can have a highly engaged A player who's not really that resilient of an individual if you push them outside of their comfort zone. Whereas you can have a disengaged person for whatever reason who is naturally a resilient individual, but for whatever reason or where they are in their career path or the amount of change they're going through, they have become less engaged. So we have, in many organizations, higher degrees of resilience, higher degrees of team members being accepting of change and willing to participate, buy in, and do the work to navigate change, but also things that were already kind of on the cusp, but digital transformation, technological advancements, greater levels of agility, to your point earlier. A lot of organizations adopted these things very quickly and successfully. So it's not just about organizations that lost a bunch of people and the revenue dipped and profitability went away. That happened obviously to some. Some organizations failed, but many have thrived in this environment because they had a culture of adaptability. They had greater levels of accountability that already existed there, and leaders at every level of the organizations that could help their teams. Not to use this term too much again, but pivot. Again, that's the last time we're going to mention that ever again. And we've seen organizations come out of this already. Some of the organizations we work with killed it during this time. They IPO, their shareholder value went through the roof. Or they've tripled in size and had a massive exit. Or they've become wildly more profitable because they've shed the fat of expensive workspace, or they've had some healthy turnover, we might call that, realizing that there were some of those actively disengaged. We really need to focus on the people that believe in being here and shed that. And typically what you see when you hang out with those people too long, things just get worse. And when you get rid of them, you're like, oh, things just got better, actually, regardless of their subject matter expertise or tenure. So I've seen a lot of organizations and leaders just make better decisions. They're more agile, and they think differently about the world around them. They think differently about the business and industry that they're in, and they think differently about the people that is their burden and opportunity and blessing to lead and inspire. And so they're looking at everything differently.
First of all, I couldn't agree more. When I think about the conversations, so I happen to be on a board. I'm in our boardroom quite often. And the dialogue around, it used to be about culture. Now it's actually much more granular than that.
Right.
And having the conversation about the various components of it and whether people are engaged. Does the company have empathy? Are we really tied to our mission? Are people aligned? How do we develop the right talent? And those conversations and getting to have individual relationships, all are things that people are really spending time on, which is such a positive byproduct of some of the changes that were happening. We're all getting used to that cadence, whether you're in the oldest generation of the workforce or you're just entering the workforce. We're all getting used to that change and that speed of change. I think that's good. And hopefully we can as leaders, create the systems for our companies to keep up with that amount of change. Sure. So Brent, first of all, thank you for joining me today. It's been great having you, great seeing you again. And I, again, appreciate all the work you do with me and my team to help us be the highest performing group we can be and help drive this digital transformation we're on, helping to lead at Wells Fargo. So again, Brent Gleeson, former Navy SEAL, award-winning author, entrepreneur, and leader. So Brent, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was an honor.
Thank you. That's it for this episode of Future Intersections. I'm Ather Williams III. Thank you for joining us today. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes where we will share advice and insights needed to stay one step ahead in today's ever-changing business landscape. If you really like this episode, please share with your peers and network. If you have a topic you'd like us to address or a guest you'd like to recommend, email us at futureintersections@wellsfargo.com. Future Intersections is produced by Wells Fargo.